I didn't necessarily plan on doing 2 Star Wars related videos in a row, but that's just kind of how things fell into place. Also, before we dig into the game in question here, I have to extend a huge thank you to everyone for 100 subscribers. It's honestly kind of surreal, and I plan on doing something a little more substantial to celebrate it in the near future. So, Star Wars Battlefront 2. It's the only game that I've covered so far that I don't actually have in my physical collection for whatever reason, so it can't hold the case up, but I can do this. Pretty awesome, right? It's definitely among some of my most treasured games from my childhood, and I think a lot of people share that sentiment. However, things have changed substantially, to say the least, since this game was released in 2005. So I thought it might be kind of fun to take a look back and see how it holds up today. Let's take a look at some gameplay and talk about it. As I already mentioned, Battlefront 2 was released in 2005, and is not to be confused with the EA reboot from 2017. It was developed by the now defunct Pandemic Studios and published by LucasArts. I was actually really impressed with how well the visuals in this game have stood the test of time. Obviously, it's a game from 2005, so it's not really going to hold a candle to the reboot from 2017. But for its time, I don't have many complaints. Some of the hero character models are somewhat...
Hello there.
Absolutely horrendous.
Are you out of your mind?
But otherwise, the characters and environments are pretty stellar as far as I'm concerned. Perhaps the most impressive aspect of the game visually is the sheer volume and variety of environments on offer. Obviously, Star Wars has like hundreds of locations to choose from, and each have their own quirks and specific characteristics that I feel this game captured really well, especially for its time. There's a bunch of recognizable and fan-favorite locations to choose from here, all of which are thoughtfully designed and have their own unique qualities and visual styles. The ruined Jedi Temple is one of my personal favorites, but you've also of course got stuff like the desert battleground of Geonosis, Bespin, the Cloud City, and even the swamps of Dagobah, and the interior of the Tantive 4, the ship from the very beginning of A New Hope. For 2005, each of these locations bear a striking resemblance to their film counterparts, and make perfect chaotic battlegrounds for the Star Wars universe. I should also mention the sound design. Once again, it's not quite as great as what we got in the 2017 Battlefront game, but it definitely sounds like Star Wars. Some of the voices for the heroes are a little... off.
All right, don't get your shorts in a knot.
But other than that, nothing sounds too terribly out of place. Generally speaking, you may not feel completely immersed in the Star Wars universe like you might when playing the 2017 reboot, but for 2005, I think this game's presentation feels surprisingly appropriate for a Star Wars property. Not to mention the nostalgia factor of this visual style, which is certainly not lost on me considering I grew up with this game. But since this is a review, I don't want to get into that too terribly much. As far as the story in this game goes, this is one of those games in which the campaign is essentially just a scripted version of the multiplayer component. Think of something like Shadowrun, which I'm just now realizing may not be the most universal example, so essentially the campaign is just the multiplayer, but you have story-related objectives and maybe a few unique elements here and there to differentiate it. Regardless though, there's a pretty decent idea for a narrative here. You play as a member of the 501st Legion of Clone Troopers and get to play through their conflicts, including the events after Order 66, up until the fall of the Empire. The coolest part about this is that, unlike the reboot, you actually get to play as the Empire for more than 2 levels. So you get to see these conflicts from the perspective that you don't see in the movies. This isn't particularly pertinent outside of the pre-level introduction, but it's an interesting concept nonetheless. There's not really a whole lot more to say about the story, though we will talk about the campaign a bit more later on. But let's move on to the combat and gameplay. You do have a choice between third and first person viewpoints, but I found the first person mode pretty hard to aim with and use, so I always stick with third person. Regardless of which viewpoint you choose though, the movement is a bit sluggish, but overall it's not terrible. Considering that this is an 18-year-old game, I'll give it a pass. Aiming isn't quite as precise as it possibly could be either, considering this mammoth of a reticle, but once again, it's nothing that's likely to ruin the experience for you. The weapons you have access to depend on your class, but are more or less the same whether you're playing as the clones, droids, stormtroopers, or rebels, at least functionally. The standard class is equipped with an automatic blaster rifle, the engineer has some kind of blaster shotgun, the sniper has a sniper rifle, and the heavy has a rocket launcher. Each class also has their own unique ability or equipment, tailoring them to certain playstyles. For instance, the engineer is able to fix vehicles and droids, and the heavy has access to explosives. Each faction also has its own special classes, for example, jet troopers or magna guards, who have unique weapons and abilities. And these classes can only be used after you get a certain number of points from killing enemies or playing the objective. It's great to have access to all of these classes, and I appreciate the variety, but I personally found no real reason to use anything other than the standard trooper class, because they kind of just have the best all-around weapon. I never found any of the other classes that necessary. Now, if I was playing against real players instead of bots, I could see some additional viability in the strategy aspect of having someone with a rocket launcher or a sniper rifle, but with bots, I just don't really see the need. Plus, I just found it more entertaining and fun to run around blasting everybody. This game only supports 16v16 battles, but honestly, I still feel that it captures the idea of hectic combat pretty well, especially for its time. I mean, it may not have the most detailed combat ever, but it's still fun to blast your way through droids or stormtroopers with your squad backing you up. Maybe it's just the nostalgia talking, but some of these battles still feel like they're right out of the films, with vehicles blasting away beside you while you attempt to overrun your enemies. Speaking of vehicles, they kind of feel like shit to control in this game, but their inclusion absolutely adds a nice dimension to the battlefield and makes battles feel more exciting and action-packed. And of course I have to mention the hero classes, which is one of the most badass and iconic parts of this game. Each faction also has a unique set of heroes that you can play as, and the hero you have access to depends on which map you're playing on, which is one thing I really wish had carried over into the reboot. It just makes a lot more sense this way. Once again, to play as these guys, you have to get a certain amount of points, but they can really turn the tide of a battle. While playing as a hero character, this little lightsaber icon in the lower left corner will slowly tick down as you go, indicating how much time you have left. But the catch is that each time you kill someone, you get a little bit more time, and every time you take damage, some of your time is taken away. I like this method because you can't really feasibly play as a hero the whole match, which could make things far too easy. But you also don't have a completely finite and entirely predetermined amount of time, as you can gain more by killing more enemies. Therefore, your performance is indicative of how much time you'll get. Now compare that to the newer Battlefront 2, in which you'll often see one player absolutely dominating for the entire round. Because not only is there no timer, your health also regenerates when you're playing as a hero, which makes scenarios like this much more common. So what's it like to actually play as these guys? Well, I'd be lying if I said it wasn't fun to run around destroying everything in sight with a lightsaber. It may not feel the smoothest to control, and it can be somewhat difficult to attack the enemy you want to. Sometimes the speed of these characters can be to their own detriment, often leading to friendly casualties, which isn't out of character for someone like General Grievous, but it might raise a few eyebrows when Luke Skywalker slices up his rebel allies. But even so, playing as a hero character is always the highlight of the match, for me at least. It just doesn't get much better than single-handedly massacring the entire enemy team with just a few lightsaber swings. It's far from the most complex saber combat out there, but something about it just feels satisfying. You'll also have access to a few force powers and lightsaber throws with each character. Most of the Jedi have essentially the same abilities. The only real variability is derived from whether they have force push or force pull, with the Sith characters having access to force lightning or force choke. These powers are simple in their execution, but they're fun to play around with, and it's good that they were included. So far I've devoted this section to discussing the lightsaber-wielding heroes, but that isn't to discount the few blaster-wielding heroes, especially Han Solo is really fun to play as. We have a few different game modes to go over as well, and where better to start than the campaign. I already went over the storyline aspect of this, but honestly, there isn't much to say gameplay-wise either. Like I mentioned before, each level will play out sort of like a multiplayer match, except you'll often have several objectives to do prior to completing a mission. For example, destroy this thing, defend this thing, etc., etc. It's a decent campaign mode considering that the main focus of this game is the multiplayer component, but as far as I'm concerned, the instant action section of this game, which is essentially multiplayer with bots, since the servers were shut down long ago, is the real heart of Battlefront 2. One of the most evidently enduring characteristics of this game is the quintessential game mode, Conquest. I say that because it was clearly the catalyst for the supremacy mode in the Battlefront reboot games. For me, this is the real meat and potatoes of the Battlefront experience. In this mode, both teams set out to capture command posts, of which there are 5. Once captured, these posts allow a new respawn point for the team that occupies it. If one team occupies all 5 command posts simultaneously, they win the match. The catch is that there are actually 2 ways to win a game of Conquest. Depleting the enemy's reinforcements to 0 will also win you the game. Reinforcements indicate the number of respawns each team has, so even if you don't have more command posts than the enemy, you still have a chance to win if you hold on to at least one. The command post capturing gameplay of this mode often leads to some really entertaining and just fun battles, even just playing against the AI. Imagine if they still had the servers running on Xbox, I'd be playing the shit out of this for sure. That's one thing I've yet to mention, the AI, which isn't great. But honestly, I don't think it's any worse than it is in the new games, if you've ever even played against bots in those games. You'll often find teammates and enemies alike just kind of standing around doing absolutely nothing as if they're taking a smoke break or something. But luckily, I found the lackluster AI didn't really impact the experience as a whole. Since the emphasis here isn't really on the individual conflicts between you and enemy units, and is rather placed upon the larger scale conflict, I didn't find the AI to be particularly problematic in this instance. Besides Conquest, there are also a few other game modes to choose from, but I didn't find any of these to be particularly compelling. At least not to the extent of Conquest. It might be important to mention though that I never really played anything other than Conquest and the campaign when I was a kid, so could be nostalgia interfering, but it's hard to say. There's 1 and 2 flag variants of Capture the Flag, but I didn't find that these larger maps and this style of gameplay really complemented it. It was a little dull and one note for me. Hero Assault is the same as Heroes vs. Villains from the reboots. This one has some potential at least, as it pits all of the heroes and villains in the game against each other, with no other units involved. But all it really does is highlight how clunky playing as the heroes can sometimes be. It's a novel mode at first, but it kind of reminds me of someone's annoying uncle who's been telling the same jokes since 1983. Funny at first, but quickly rendered monotonous. And then you have Hunt, whose description makes it sound like some awful Christopher Columbus fanfiction or something. Could they have maybe phrased it in a way that didn't make it sound like genocide? It's a lot more harmless than it sounds though. Basically, you either play as the normal infantry units or the resident species of whatever planet you're playing on. The standard unit's goal is to kill all of the species before the timer runs out, and the species just have to try and survive until that point. On second thought, that sounds pretty bad even without the haunting description. Aside from that though, I don't really see how this mode could hold anyone's attention for more than a few minutes. There just isn't enough complexity here to warrant coming back to play more of it. Space battles are one aspect of this game that I'm not exactly excited to talk about, mainly because my opinion of them seems to have soured over the years. Don't get me wrong, for the time of this game's release, these are executed really well. And it's really cool to participate in these battles that look like something right out of the films. Personally, I just didn't find them all that intriguing. Boarding the enemy ship is the only thing I really look forward to when playing these, at which point it kind of takes the form of a normal multiplayer battle. The ship combat isn't awful, but I don't see it as this game's strong suit necessarily. Regardless, for their time, these space battles are phenomenal. For me, they just aren't my personal favorite part of the game. Okay, so there is one more portion of this game that I haven't really talked about yet, and that's because I didn't really play it at all. So, Galactic Conquest is an entirely separate mode in which you choose a faction and then participate in a series of battles in an attempt to control more of the galaxy than your enemy. I'm really sorry if there are any big Galactic Conquest fans out there, but this has just never been my thing. If some of you do happen to be big Galactic Conquest fans though, feel free to leave me a comment and let me and others know why you like it. I'd love to hear about it. Overall, I was glad to find that this game honestly still has a lot going for it, even after 18 years. I think that most Star Wars fans will really appreciate the hectic combat and the ability to create your own battles that resemble the ones you see in the films. It might not look like much compared to the reboots, but I'd say this is a pretty damn good game, even today. Not to mention just how nostalgic this game is for me and I'm assuming many other people. Before I go, I do want to mention that I have a new single out, which you should theoretically be hearing in the background of this video as we speak. You can find it over on my music channel, which is just called Henry Schultz, and you can also find it on your streaming service of choice. Just search Henry Schultz and it should come up. And I'll also leave some links to where you can find it in the description. Also, thank you all once again for 100 subscribers. For me, it's a really incredible milestone, and I honestly can't believe we were able to reach my goal that I had last year and get to that point before the end of the year, which we managed to do, which is so awesome. So thank you all again for that. I appreciate all of you, and I can't wait to see where this channel ends up by the end of this year. Also, here's a little bit of that single I was just talking about if you'd like a preview. I'll see you when I see you. Bye.
When your heart stopped, could never be me. Again I'm left at some bar